This slideshow will focus on the late start stages of the war, of the Civil War, leading up to the end. So now there's a wholesale change in strategy, and what happened is Ulysses S. Grant was brought over to fight against Lee in the east, and he left his subordinate, his underling, William Tecumseh Sherman, in control of the entire war happening in the west. Okay, and so now in the east, the entire strategy was about to change. And that started with the battle in the wilderness, or the wilderness campaign. The wilderness was a dense forest, really, really thick, right around Fredericksburg, Virginia, and there was a ton of fighting that happened there. 2 days, intense fighting, heavy casualties. Both sides were losing a lot of people, and the North was losing more people than the South. However, when that battle ended, the northern troops under General Grant just kept moving on. Okay, they didn't stop, they didn't recuperate, they didn't wait for reinforcements or anything like that. They just kept moving on. So they started right there in the wilderness and they kept moving on down to Spotsylvania. And in Spotsylvania, they were fighting for 11 days, really, really intense fighting again. A lot of the combat was hand to hand combat as opposed to sitting back and shooting each other. So it was very, very intense warfare, exhausting, and all that kind of stuff. And so, as you can tell, just kind of by the strategy, by what I'm talking about, is there's no waiting around anymore. Grant is going to force the issue. He's going to make something happen. And so, because he has so many more troops at his disposal, he can switch them out and do different things like that. Whereas the South is losing troops that they don't have enough people to switch out. They just have way less troops, and so every Confederate casualty or loss is like 3 or 4 or 5 Union losses, and so it's a lot harder on the Confederacy than it is on the North, on the Union. And so these circumstances, the way he was pushing it, before there were weeks of time between battles to get new supplies, to get new reinforcements, to get all that figured out, and now the war would just continue without any break. So it was like this savage, intense combat, and then you would advance on to the next battle, and then you may retreat a little bit and dig your trenches, and then you're going to advance again and combat again. And these four things were basically the soldier's entire life for this entire campaign for quite a while here. So being unable to break through at Spotsylvania, this is the same map we're looking at on the last slide here, being able to break through there, and really the goal is to get here to Richmond and take that over. Grant just kept pushing on and continued on. He went down and made his way down to Cold Harbor, which was a very important crossroads where he could potentially get his men towards Richmond. And so he decided that he would do an all-out attack, a full assault on Cold Harbor, and sent his men in. And his men, the Union men, had about 7,000 casualties. So 7,000 people were injured or killed, whereas the Confederates only had about 1,500 casualties. So Lee had again completely turned away this large army of the Union. And so, seeing that he had just lost that, Grant ordered a cavalry raid up to the north and the east of Richmond in order to try to distract the South. Okay, and that worked pretty well. So cavalry, remember, those are our troops that are on horseback, okay? So they can move quickly and raid and get away and do all that kind of stuff. And so he sent them up, and they were raiding in the north and the east of Richmond to try and make them feel like that's where the attack was going to come from. And Grant instead took his people, his troops, and headed south and east. And then he came across the James River here, and he crossed the James River and headed to Petersburg. Okay, he was heading to Petersburg to try to capture this super important rail line, right? A railroad that went in and was supplying Richmond with most of their stuff. Okay, from the south. And so when the troops got to Petersburg, they paused, they stopped, and they looked at what was set up. And in front of them, the defenses were very, very strong. There were 20-foot thick barricades set up, so 20 feet thick that you can't really shoot through. You got to go over, got to get around it. Really, really difficult to do. Really well placed cannons that could fire down on you as you were trying to attack. And in front of these barricades, there were 15-foot deep trenches that you would have to try to get over as you're being fired upon and trying to get there. And so basically all of this made it impossible to take the city. Okay, the people, the soldiers realized, and General Grant realized, that this would be absolute suicide if they tried to just do a full-out attack on Petersburg. So instead, what they did was a siege. They put that city under siege. And remember, a siege is just surrounding and cutting off Petersburg from supplies, okay, so that they cannot, get anything back. So they put the city under siege. The siege lasted about 10 months, okay, where they were waiting outside of it and not allowing anybody coming in. Small battles would happen and things like that. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to check out what's happening in the West at this time, and then we'll come back to Richmond to see what happened after Petersburg. Now, in the West, the fighting was going, I would say, even better for the Union than it was in the East. Okay, they were gaining lots of ground, having a lot of victories, and one of those was in Mobile Harbor in Alabama. David Farragut had his ships. He had 18 ships, and he took them past the forts to get into Mobile Harbor, and he was crossing, trying to pass 3 Confederate forts and get into that harbor. And as he was doing this, a mine, which they used to call a torpedo back then, blew up the first Union ship. It exploded the ship. Okay, and there they were. All of the ships stopped, and they were sitting there saying, or trying to figure out what to do, and they were right in the firing line of all 3 of those Confederate forts, which was a very dangerous place to be. And so David Farragut made a decision, and he said, his quote was, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Remember, damn the mines, basically. Full speed ahead, and he led the way with his ship going first. Okay, they were able to get past those forts and get into the harbor, and they quickly destroyed the entire Confederate fleet that was defending Mobile inside of that harbor. Now, they didn't take the town of Mobile, okay, but again, they sealed off Mobile's Bay. At this point now, there were no goods that could be moved in or out of the entire Deep South, okay? So they were cut off from the rest of the South. They were cut off from the rest of the country. They were essentially completely cut off at this point, okay? And on land, William Tecumseh Sherman was marching, or was on his famous March to the Sea, okay, and really infamous if you're looking at the people in the South, because in the South he's one of the most hated men ever, because he came through and destroyed everything that he touched, basically. And so he was able to take Atlanta, and when he took Atlanta, he ordered the people to leave. He said, "You need to get out of here. I'm about to do some bad stuff," essentially. And his strategy was total war. Okay, total war, and the quote about it is, he wanted to make the old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of the war. So he wasn't out there attacking and killing these people, but he wanted to make it really hard on and kill the soldiers, and then he wanted to make it super hard on the civilians as well. And so he went through the entire city and burned anything of military value. So weapons, farms, shops, goods, anything like that, factories, okay, especially railroad depots, okay, the fires spread throughout Atlanta and burned a lot of the city. And as he was marching then out to the sea and up to the north, he left behind him a 60-mile wide, at some spots, path of destruction all the way through Georgia. He would go through and go into houses and take all their stuff and mess it up. He would burn their crops so that the southern people didn't have food to eat. He would kill their cattle if he couldn't take them for his men, again, so that they would rot and there would be no food for the people in the South to eat. They would loot, steal things, and burn towns all the way to the ground. Okay, When they reached the sea, after they had done all this destruction, they continued to do it. They just turned north and started to march through South Carolina, doing the same thing. And this total war, even with Lee winning some battles out to the east, just completely demoralized Southerners. They started to feel like, I want this war over. This war is affecting me. Like, my stuff is ruined, my entire home is ruined. It's obvious the North is going to win, and it took all of their will to fight away from many of Southerners. Take a moment to answer checkpoint 1 question. And so the election of 1864 came in the middle of this wartime, and the two sides were General George B. McClellan, who was a Democrat. Remember the guy that Abraham Lincoln fired before as the general, and Abraham Lincoln was the Republican, and McClellan wanted the war over. He said that he agreed to negotiate an end to the war with the South if the South would just rejoin the Union. So we could still talk about slavery, we could still talk about all this stuff. Let's just start over and quit fighting each other. Whereas Abraham Lincoln, we know what he felt. He felt like the South had done the wrong thing and we didn't need to negotiate. And he had already done emancipation and things like that, and really wanted this to now become an issue, or wanted the issue of slavery to become an issue here. Okay, and so as the election was happening, it just so happened that Atlanta was captured by William Tecumseh Sherman at that point, and it got people again reinvigorated and supporting the war more, as they really felt like the Union was finally going to win this war. And really, it was just in time. Lincoln was able to get 55% of the overall vote and to get reelected as the president for his second term. And when he saw this, when this happened and he got his election, he thought of it as kind of an authorization, or they call it a mandate. Like, now you have elected me, which tells me that you agree with me and I can take drastic actions. So he took it as an authorization to end slavery permanently. And so he tried to get the 13th Amendment passed. Okay, and on January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment passed the House of Representatives and was sent to the states to be voted on for ratification. And the 13th Amendment, after it was ratified, banned all slavery in the United States of America. So the battling continued during that 10-month period while Petersburg was under siege. And near the end of it, the Battle of Five Forks happened, which kind of broke open this entire war and really kind of ended it. Right? The Battle of Five Forks, what happened is Union cavalry troops under Sheridan that we had talked about before. He and his cavalry troops were able to cut the last railroad line into Petersburg. So now there was no supply point into Petersburg, and eventually it would most certainly fall, which would leave Richmond open from the south. Okay, a lot easier for them to go in and attack it if the Union wanted to. And so the very next day after this happened, Lee's troops left the city of Petersburg and started to run as fast as they could to the west to escape Grant's army and try to find a defensive position where they could, get their feet back under them and keep the war going. However, the cavalry was able to get around Lee, and those cavalry troops blocked Lee's movement and blocked the road at Appomattox Courthouse. So that's kind of our last spot here. We just did the Battle of Five Forks. Lee's men started to run along this red line, right? There was a battle here, and then they got here, but the Union had already come around and was able to stop them at Appomattox Courthouse. There was a small battle that happened there, and Lee realized that his troops were completely surrounded, 100% outnumbered, and he surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, which pretty much ended the war. Okay, and the terms of surrender that Grant came up with were very, very kind to the people of the South, right? There was no punishment, no prosecuting the soldiers for treason, none of that stuff. All it was if you will leave your weapons, you can go. You can even take with you your horses. And he said, take your horses with you to put in a crop to make it through the winter. Okay. Lee was obviously really disappointed that he had lost this war, but he did thank Grant for that extra kindness that he did, and he thought it would do a lot towards bringing the people back together. Okay, we're going to see in Reconstruction that kindness wasn't always followed through, which led to some different problems. But this kindness let this war end quickly and in a kind of a civil way at the very end. And Abraham Lincoln at this point was just doing his second inaugural address. He talked about the plan for the future government in the South, okay, and he talked about his plan to include African Americans in the South's government, allow them to be part of the government, allow them to be maybe voting in it, things like that. And John Wilkes Booth was sitting there looking at him thinking, yeah, this will be your last speech that you give, because he had a plan to kill Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was warned not to go into public without an escort, but his wife really wanted him to go to a play with him, and so on April 14th, 1865, he went to Ford's Theater with his wife to see a play, An American Cousin. Okay, and a famous actor was able to get in behind his box that he was going to see the play and sneak up behind him with a gun and shoot him in the back of the head. And later on, he was dead because of it. He died because of this gunshot wound to the back of the head. So he was assassinated in this way. And we'll talk more in class about this assassination for sure, get a little more of the story, but understand that it was John Wilkes Booth, famous actor, who came in, shot him in the back of the head, killed him on April 14th of 1865. From the war, after the war, everything was kind of changed. All right, the entire country had been changed, and there were a lot of big changes that had happened to the government, and especially the South. Okay, first off, the federal government had more power over the states than it had before. This whole argument was about states' rights or the federal government, and the federal government side had won. Okay, so they had more power than they ever had before, and really haven't given up a lot of that power as we move through history. It also ended the enslavement of millions of people, so it freed millions and millions of slaves, which was great. Okay. However, for the South was now completely devastated socially and economically. All of their systems were built on slavery, and now they were stuck not being able, or not, they had to start over. They had to start from fresh, and they had to start from fresh with a new social system, with a new economic system, in a land that had been completely torn apart by war, because almost all of the fighting happened in the South. Okay. And it was just a terrible situation for the South. They were at a really big disadvantage. Now that you finished the notes, take a moment to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you have no questions, then create 3 test or quiz questions that you might see on from this material.